I am delighted to introduce Dr. Christina Lee Kim, an Associate Professor of Psychology and Associate Dean in the Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University. She also currently serves as the Undergrad Psychology Department Chair. Dr. Kim is a licensed clinical psychologist. However, her current professional activities lie mostly in the realm of teaching, research, and administrative responsibilities. Her research areas include cross-cultural and multicultural psychology, mental health and the church, Asian American psychology, and the use of qualitative research methods. Dr. Kim and her husband have 3 daughters and are active members of Living Hope Community Church in Brea, California. Dr. Kim is my colleague at Rosemead, and I also took some classes with her when I was a student here. Her classes were memorable for many reasons, but one of them being her exams were not easy. So she had high standards for her students, but I also knew that she had high standards for herself. High quality lectures, very engaging, and always brought her full self to her classes. I'm so delighted to have her share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christina Lee Kim.
All right, thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to be here. As I was preparing and praying about what to talk about, I was like, God, you got to give me a word. Because they told me, address rupture and repair in the church. And I felt God impress upon my heart that perhaps what I was to address was not the ruptures that are obvious, the ones that are marked by external conflict, but the ones that might be more common to many of us. And these are ruptures that are more internal. They are those that stay hidden. Sometimes they leak out, which we'll talk about, but sometimes, we sort of just tuck them away in our hearts. And sometimes we're aware that those ruptures are there, those lingering tensions, and other times we actually may have become so accustomed, as Jessica mentioned, to dealing in certain ways with this that we're not even aware of their existence until something triggers it. And so my hope for this talk today is to give a bit of insight into what kinds of things might contribute to these ruptures and how we might ask God's help for the church to be a place that can attend to them and facilitate repair and start bringing hope and healing to all of us. And so if you just pray with me, I just want to give this time to God. Father, thank you so much for this conference and this place to explore honestly with one another the things that might keep us from fully experiencing your grace. And I ask for your help as we delve into this topic of rupture and repair in the church. Would you give us insight, discernment? Would you give us courage to respond in obedience in areas where your Spirit might be nudging us? Thank you for your goodness and mercy always. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so let's talk about ruptures. Jessica also mentioned a definition of them, and I think how I'm going to define ruptures, and in psychology, ruptures often refer to a breakdown or a strain, a disruption in a relationship or a relational connection. It's a word that we commonly use in therapy contexts and in attachment research. And ruptures, they can be small, they can be large, but they usually involve moments of misattunement, so misunderstanding, emotional disconnection. And in attachment research, a rupture occurs when there's a temporary failure even of emotional attunement between two people. And as such, they can be quite common occurrences. Like every day, maybe we might experience ruptures in our relationships. Like for example, consider, let's say you have a parent who's picking their child up from school and the child's super excited to say what they learned in school that day, but mom is so distracted by getting home and her emails that she kind of just tunes out and misses the opportunity to attend to her child's excitement and enthusiasm. And so then what does the child feel? Like a little disappointment, right? Feeling like they were missed. This is like a small rupture. Or maybe a similar experience. I was telling my husband this example. And then he goes, what about examples of us? So he's like, this happens in our relationship often, where I come home and I am actually such an introvert. And so when I come home after a long day at work and interacting with a lot of people, I kind of zone out and I play games on my phone. And he'll come into the room. My husband's the extrovert, and he's looking for a moment of connection with me. And usually this bid for connection starts with, hey, so what are you doing? And me, in my zone, I hear, hey, what are you doing? And I say, I'm playing games on my phone. I answered his question, but I missed his bid for connection. And that's like a little rupture that happens. Now, these can happen all the time. And in healthy relationships, as common as they are, they can also be easily repaired. I'm so sorry, buddy. What is it? Like, right? Like, here, I'm attending to you now. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, honey. Like, I was so distracted. Tell me what you learned today in school, and, matching their enthusiasm. We can repair it. And when there's a successful repair attempt, the relationship is restored and maintained. But if the repair attempt is not successful, or there's no attempt at all, and that rupture continues to exist, it can, over time, accumulate, build strain in the relationship, become resentment and hurt, and this can lead then to outward external conflict, or it can lead to an inward withdrawal or disengagement, and this is the danger of hidden ruptures, right? So I'm going to say that hidden ruptures are relational disconnections that are not openly addressed, and in the church, this can look like continued participation, politeness, spiritual language, the person's still serving, still attending, still smiling, still showing up, but there is a distance. There is a disconnection, maybe even a hurt, and they're not talking about it. Actually, as I was thinking about this presentation, it reminded me of a situation we had in our home back in I don't remember what year it was, a couple of years ago, where we had to tent it for termites. Has anyone ever had to tent their house for termites? So I first noticed that we might have a potential termite problem when I came into my bedroom one afternoon, and I looked along the windowsill, and I saw this. Okay. I was like, ew, what is that? And they looked like little wings of bugs, and it was like scattered all over the windowsill, and I thought, what is that? I've never seen this before. So I started doing some internet sleuthing and very quickly realized, oh, this is evidence of a termite swarm. And I'm like, oh no, does this mean we have termites, right? And I kind of ignored the problem. I used a little vacuum and sucked them up. But then, a couple of days later, there they were again. And when you look at the windowsill, it looked perfectly fine. Like, where was this coming from? Like, is there a crack in our window? Like, what is this? And then I looked really carefully along the door frame, because we have a door that leads to the balcony. And I saw, it's going to come back up, that tiny little pinhole you see, okay? And I was like, what is that? Okay, now, I didn't press upon that one. That's why I have a picture of it. But if you look at the bigger piece of tape over, and then if you look downward, I actually took that pinhole and I kind of pushed my finger against it, and it just caved in. Okay, so see, if you look at the bottom part, you see the part where there's a crack, and then the up part where the tape is, my husband just went, and then it went in, and here, termites flew out. It was so like a horror movie, okay? It was scary. I pressed it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so awful. But the frame looked perfectly fine. It's when we applied pressure, it just caved. And imagine, let's say you have a church community where there are internal hidden ruptures. It's not going to withstand much pressure before everything caves, even though everything looks great on the outside. People are smiling, right? In the church, we can experience ruptures with one another, perhaps in our small groups, in ministry contexts. We can experience ruptures with our church leaders, with our pastors. Our pastors can experience ruptures with their congregation members. We can also experience ruptures with God. Not that God misattunes to us, but perhaps the ways we interpret or perceive how God is dealing with us. Maybe you've been praying for something for a really long time and you're getting no answer. And you're frustrated. Is God even listening? is, does God even care about me? So there's all these things going on, and there's a lot of reasons for relational ruptures, and they can happen over any manner of topic, but I think at a foundational level, there's typically an unfulfilled need that is happening here. And I'm thinking of just 3. There could be more, but sometimes in the church, I think we see an unfulfilled need for value, to feel like you matter. So this goes unfulfilled when you feel like you've been dismissed or unappreciated, when you feel invisible, maybe you feel misunderstood, like maybe you're trying to explain something and the person you're talking to, it sounds like it looks like they're listening to you, but you can tell they're only listening to think of what they're going to tell you next, right? And you don't feel valued. Your experience doesn't feel valued. That's a moment of misattunement and disconnection. It could be an unfulfilled need for security, to feel safe. This would go unfulfilled when some aspect of you feels anxious or threatened. Maybe that place in your church environment, you sense a threat to your emotional safety. Like you can't really share something because you're afraid of how somebody's going to react. Or maybe it's a critical environment. You're afraid to bring up ideas for something or disagree with someone because it doesn't feel emotionally safe. It could be an unfulfilled need for belonging, to feel accepted and connected to the group. And this would go unfulfilled when you feel excluded, like you don't fit in. And, all of these sound very similar, but they're slightly different. For example, you can belong, like you can be a part of the group, but not feel valued in the group. You can feel valued but not feel very secure. So maybe you feel appreciated, but you also feel like you're walking a little bit on eggshells around your peoples. You can feel secure but not feel like you truly belong. And so if we were to consider ruptures that you yourself may have experienced in a church context, or maybe you're aware of ruptures that somebody else has experienced, can you identify what was the unfulfilled need that was happening there? I'm thinking of an example. Let's say a church member has an idea for a ministry, a new ministry that they want to start at the church. So they bring this example up maybe to the pastor or a church leader or deacon or elder, and then that idea gets sort of quickly dismissed, like, oh, that might not work because of this and all, right? And so then that church member, maybe in that moment, it's possible that they felt undervalued. Maybe they felt a little insecure, like they brought up an idea, they were really excited to bring it up, and like it felt kind of squashed and they don't feel really safe to bring up ideas. And maybe they feel a lack of belonging. Maybe their idea was a bid to be a part of the ministry group, but felt like somehow that was not open to them because their idea was dismissed. Whether with other people or with God, sometimes, again, we're very aware when these ruptures occur, and sometimes we're not. And as this is a conference on Asian American mental health, I think it's an appropriate space to consider the ways that our Asian culture, even our Christian culture in an Asian American context, can sometimes work to keep these ruptures hidden or tucked away. And I think the ability to understand and deal well with ruptures in an Asian American Christian context, we can look at it kind of at 3 different levels. And so the first level, and I loved Jessica's talk because I think this parallels so much with what she's saying too, it's self-awareness. Many Asian cultures have been described, thank you so much, as interdependent and collectivistic. You've heard this, right? Okay, interdependent and collectivistic. And while these descriptors can often be overused or overly simplistic, I think that there is truth that in many Asian cultures, our tendency is to raise, develop, socialize members of our community to not just be mindful of your own experience, but to be mindful of the group, okay? That's how your parents maybe raise you or emphasize things. And so, for example, if you are Korean, maybe you're familiar with the concept of nunchi. And even if you're not Korean, maybe you're familiar with this concept. It's a type of social awareness that is highly valued in Korean culture. I'm a huge BTS fan. And I was actually watching a video of BTS talking about the word nunchi, and they gave an example of this word. They say, let's say that your group of coworkers and your boss all go to coffee together. And your boss orders first, he orders just a plain black coffee. cheapest thing on the menu, okay? And then they said, and then imagine the youngest coworker of the group comes along and orders a really fancy coffee, 4 pumps of syrup, extra toppings, everything. And they would say, this is a coworker that has poor nunchi, okay? They didn't sense what was happening in the group, right? Now, what's interesting is that the phenomenon of nunchi actually has been researched psychologically. Specifically, I'm thinking back in 2017, one of my grad students, Jung-Yeon, she did a dissertation where she was comparing the Korean concept of nunchi to the American or Western concept of emotional intelligence, and this is a comparative study. And one of the things she found in her study, and she didn't set out to find it, but it just so happened we saw it, was that she found that amongst the Korean students in her study, that just because they were aware of other people's feelings and they had good nunchi, they were socially aware, it did not correlate with their self-awareness. Okay, so just because they were aware socially and able to pick up on what somebody else might be feeling, it did not mean that they were easily able to articulate what they're feeling. And for many of us, maybe we resonate with this either in ourselves or with people we know. I don't practice clinically anymore, but when I used to, I often saw examples of clients who were quite attentive and able to pick up what other people were feeling, but when I asked them to articulate what they were feeling, they really struggled to identify and articulate that. Okay, so self-awareness, I'm going to come back to this later. Let me talk about cultural values. Research on Asian Americans frequently highlights that we operate within contexts where our emotions and our thoughts are moderated by the social context that we are in. Let me give you an example to explain. So, for example, Asian Americans, we see evidence of a tendency to suppress your own emotions for the sake of social harmony, okay? Meaning, like when you're in a room and nobody's there, maybe your emotions all come out. But when you're in a room where there's certain people there or certain types of people, and it'll look different. When you're with your friends, it'll look different. Certain emotions will come out. When you're with your grandparents, it may look really different, right? When you're with a pastor or something, you know, okay? So we adjust. We adjust the way we express our emotions and even, you know, dependent on the social context that we're in. Contrast that to Western independent cultures that may not necessarily feel that need to suppress emotions. We do in some situations, but maybe. Now, let's consider some of the Asian cultural values that might impact this tendency on emotional self-control. For example, maintaining harmony is a prominent Asian cultural value, and East Asians, in psychological studies, there's generally evidence that supports this idea that East Asians particularly prioritize social harmony, conformity, obedience, group cohesion over individual uniqueness. And this is often described as a preference for not sticking out. And so there have been some really famous studies that demonstrate this tendency. For example, some of you might be familiar with Kim and Marcus's The Pen Experiment. This is not actually their experiment. I just chose a picture of pens. Okay, but in this experiment, they offered a bunch of different colored pens, and they had pens that were sort of plainly colored, and then they had pens that had a very unique or flashy color. And they noticed that American participants predominantly chose the unique colored pens, whereas the Korean participants in their study preferred the common colored pens, which they interpreted as a desire to just not stick out, right? Just take something sort of practical, not stick out. Or consider common proverbs, like in Western culture, we say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And this is an encouragement to be squeaky, yes? We say, keep speaking up, because if you do, you know, keep asking, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Whereas, you know, in other Asian culture, we see the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. This is an encouragement not to stick out, right? Because, again, this sort of reflects some of the Confucian influences, right? Like a harmony, modesty, group stability. Now, maintaining harmony is not a uniquely Asian cultural value by far. It shows up in the Bible everywhere, right? Make every effort to keep unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Make every effort to live in peace. I want you to live in harmony with each other. And so maintaining harmony is a directive to the believer that it's a good to pursue this. However, sometimes we might rationalize or deceive ourselves that we are maintaining harmony when in actuality, we're actually just avoiding addressing something that needs to be addressed. Another Asian cultural value that might contribute to our tendency towards avoiding addressing ruptures would be saving face, if you're familiar with this. In many Asian cultural contexts, we see an emphasis on protecting a person's social dignity, honor, reputation, both our own, but also for others, especially in public settings. To save face means we avoid anything that would cause another person to feel embarrassed or that might threaten a loss to their dignity. And so this could look like a tendency to not give feedback directly, maybe do it in an indirect manner, avoid confrontation, maybe provide explanations or cover so that someone won't feel embarrassed. And saving face serves the function of maintaining this relational harmony, which I think I'm going to talk about later can be such a strength in Asian culture. It's an example of us looking out for each other, right, and honoring one another. However, the shadow side of saving face can mean that sometimes we avoid addressing what needs to be addressed because we're worried about how it's going to threaten how somebody feels. Consider a situation where someone in the church has a conflict with a church leader, but to address the situation feels really intimidating and difficult, not just because of the power differential, but because you care about that person and you don't want to embarrass them, right? And so you avoid it or you hold on to it. And it might also cause them shame. So shame. Shame is such a powerful contributor to hiding, isn't it? In Genesis, we see the very first act of disobedience when Adam and Eve, they ate of the tree of the knowledge of knowledge of good and evil, and immediately their disobedience introduces shame and the desire to hide their nakedness, themselves from God. Why is shame such a thing in Asian culture? Shame actually serves an important function in a lot of Asian cultural contexts. It's socially embedded. It functions as a relational regulator because in collectivist countries where shame is tied to family honor and social roles and group, it heightens your awareness of how your actions might be affecting someone else. And in the best case scenario, shame works to motivate repair towards maintaining harmony. However, when shame becomes chronic, excessive, when you have colliding cultural worldviews also, which I'm going to talk about next, shame can shift from promoting connection to undermining it. What do I mean by these colliding cultural worldviews? This is the third layer of consideration, is an acknowledgement of our larger contextual kind of experience here as Asian Americans. Since we're talking about shame, let's start here. I was just talking about the function of shame in Asian cultures, but in the Asian American experience, people are navigating two different emotional systems at the same time. On the one hand, you have the dominant US model that encourages individual expression, direct communication, a focus on self-esteem, but then you may have also internalized, and maybe more so for first-generation immigrants, but you've also maybe internalized models of our Asian heritage cultural values that emphasize interdependence, harmony, and shame as an emotional regulator. And so then you have Asian immigrant parents, they might utilize shame with their children in ways that are consistent to their cultural experience, intending it to be a way for that child to know to stay aligned with our family, emphasize respect. But they're acculturated children who have internalized more of the dominant US values. They experience this shame as a message of rejection, criticism, inadequacy, right? Younger generation acculturated children may also enact the American values they've internalized. So they speak up for themselves. They speak honestly, directly. Maybe they advocate for their needs, which can then sometimes be experienced by Asian immigrant parents as a display of disrespect or role disruption. Okay, so there's multiple cultural systems happening here. In addition to things like that, like, acculturation and whatnot, immigration-related stress is a really real factor to consider. If you are in a family where you have Asian immigrant parents, maybe they're working really hard and not as available to their children. Maybe there are language barriers that prohibit deeper conversations and interactions. Maybe there are experiences of discrimination and racism and marginalization that add another layer of context here. And so there's a lot of things that can contribute to our inability sometimes to recognize the ruptures or address the ruptures that we experience. And going back to the topic of self-awareness, one of the classes I teach here at Biola is developmental psychology, and we talk about it with little kids. What's the way that you facilitate self-awareness in children? This is like, okay, so I was trying to find a picture of crying children, and I thought, oh, this is so mean. And so I looked through my own phone, and okay, this is my youngest daughter. I don't know why I took this picture of her while she was crying. Says something about me. But she's clearly upset about something, and I don't remember what she was upset about. But what happens is when a little child, like let's say she's crying because she fell, okay, and she hurt herself, and she's coming to me now, okay. Parents, what we do naturally, hopefully, I don't know, is we'll say like, oh no, what happened? Are you okay? Did you fall down? Oh, it hurt when you fell down, didn't you? Okay. This very natural way of responding to children, what it's actually doing, it's affecting their brain. It is creating and strengthening a neural pathway between their emotional center of their brain, the limbic system, and their prefrontal cortex that helps them to articulate and understand what's happening. And if you have enough of these instances where you're like, oh, you're sad, or you're hurt because you fell. Oh, you're sad because he took that toy away from you. Oh, you're like angry because this happened to you at school. What that does is as parents, we're helping our child develop self-awareness and an emotional skill. We can do this, and I've seen, just because we're Asian doesn't mean we don't do this, okay? But there are funny, if you ever type into your internet, Google search or whatever, Asian parents versus Western parents, how they respond to children when they fall down, okay? You'll see funny videos pop up, okay? Where the child falls down and the Western parent is like, oh, are you okay? And then the Korean parent is like, what did I tell you? Are you listening to mom or are you not? Right? Okay, this happens sometimes in Korean culture. But okay, let's say though that we have good parents that are doing this. Even our Asian immigrant parents are doing this socializing and helping us make these connections. And as I just put this picture up here because I thought it was cute. But as kids are growing and as they get older, if we think back to if there are some language barriers, if there are situations where parents are just not as available to their children to attune to them as they get older, and as the emotions become much more complicated than simply falling down and being hurt. Maybe you're navigating friend drama in middle school, and it's a lot more complicated emotions. And there can sometimes, for Asian families, be some barriers to parents' ability to do this well with their children. Now, this can happen in all families, not just Asian families, and we see evidence of this everywhere. But I think for Asian immigrant families, even more so, there's some more challenges for parents to be able to, because of language and other things, do this well with their children. I know that for myself, I was born and raised here. My parents immigrated. I don't really remember instances of them asking me, oh, how are you feeling? How does that make you feel? That was not an experience I grew up with. And because of language barriers, I really could not process with them things that I was going through, hard like relational things or whatever. My parents loved me and I knew that, but this was not an emotional skill that was being developed in me via my family, okay? So we've talked about self-awareness, cultural values, broader contextual values, and I think sometimes when ruptures are small, we also can take lessons from some of the research on microaggressions that talks about what are some additional reasons we may fail to address ruptures. Attributional ambiguity is a really fancy way of saying, you're not sure if it happened. Have you ever been in that situation where it's like, ooh, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but I'm not sure if they meant to offend me, so response indecision is a really fancy way to say, you don't know how to respond in the moment. If you're like me, something happens and I'm like, I don't know how to respond. And then 3 hours later, I'm like, I wish I said this, okay? Like I think of what it is, but I can't think of it in the moment. Time-limited responding is a fancy way to say the situation's over before you've had a chance to respond to it. And it might seem awkward to be like, 14 minutes ago, you said this. And it really bothered me. It just seems inappropriate to bring it back up. Impotency of actions is a fancy way to say, even if you were to address it, it wouldn't do any good anyways. Like maybe that person, you don't trust that they will receive it well, maybe that they would be defensive, fearing consequences. When there's a power differential especially, we might not address something if it's somebody who's in a position of authority over you. And then denial, going back to this idea of sometimes the way we handle this is it's easier just to say, oh no, it was nothing. And we just kind of push it under and we deny it. So all of these things can lead us to hold ruptures inside, and without proper attention, this can cause cumulative buildup. That then leads to confrontation or withdrawal. And I think sometimes in the church, I don't think you see as much confrontation because the easier way is just to leave the church, okay? But sometimes when the ruptures stay in the church, it's more like inward, like a quiet quitting or a disengagement with certain people. And if we're not aware, and if it kind of builds up over time, the danger then is that these ruptures will leak. I call this psychological leaking, okay? That it does come out in some other way. God did not mean for us to just hold it all like this. It's going to seep out. And what does it look like when it seeps out? Irritability, passive aggression, sarcastic comments, cynicism, disengagement. There could be a lot more, right? But things leak out. Imagine a church now where its members are all holding these hidden ruptures. And just like my termite wall, everything looks fine on the inside, but so much more difficult to withstand when your church experiences a challenge or a crisis or something. So now what? What do we do now? The beautiful thing is God has given us the ability to repair. In fact, I think the whole point of Jesus coming and dying on the cross, saving us, is so that we could repair our relationship with God and repair our relationship with one another. The Bible gives us some beautiful examples of repair. And the first one that came to mind, and maybe you're thinking of it too, looking at this picture, is the passage in John 21 when Jesus reinstates Peter. This is after Jesus had died and been resurrected. Peter and a couple of his friends, they go out fishing all night and they're not catching anything. And then early one morning, Jesus is standing on the shore and he says, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" And they're like, "No." And he's like, "Throw your net on this side." And they do. And then all of a sudden they catch all this fish. And it says the disciple whom Jesus loved, I think referring to John, speaks to Peter and says, "It's the Lord." And as soon as Peter hears it's the Lord, the Bible tells us that he jumps into the water and he just starts swimming to shore, right? And the disciples are following behind with all their fish, And verse 9 says, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." And he says, "Come and have breakfast." And so they eat. I think as Asians, perhaps we can relate to the presence of food or a meal as a facilitator of repair. Actually, in the very early stages of my relationship with my husband, and we've been married, it will be 23 years this month. But in the early years when we were not quite dating, but we were hanging out a lot, my mom did not like him. Okay, she did not. And she made her disapproval known by actively trying to set me up with other people, even though she knew I was spending time with him. And she would not acknowledge him when he came to the door to pick me up. She really did not like him. And it became so uncomfortable for my husband, then boyfriend or hanging out buddy, that he stopped coming to the door altogether. So when we would go out, he would drive up to my house and he would just call me, "I'm outside," and I would just go outside, because it was just so awkward and uncomfortable. at a certain point, I think my parents realized he was not going away and that their daughter was quite smitten with this guy. And it was actually my dad who convinced my mom to give him a chance. So I remember one night I was getting ready to go out with him, and I was heading to the door. He had called me. I'm outside, so I was like going downstairs, and my mom comes out of the kitchen with a Tupperware full of marinated meat, kalbi, Korean kalbi, okay? And if you know, it's good stuff, okay? So she comes out with this Tupperware, and she hands it to me, and I said, what is this, right? And she said, give this to Elgin. And immediately I understood this was her attempt at repair. Okay, no words, no apologies. It was just have him eat it. Okay. My husband, who is also Korean, he also immediately understood it as a gesture of repair, accepted it, and from that point on, he would, when he picked me up, come to the door, greet her with a polite bow, and she would acknowledge him, and the repair attempt had been successful, and now we're married, right? Okay. So in John 21, we see a scene of Jesus reinstating Peter. There was a rupture in their relationship caused by Peter's denial 3 times of Jesus, and Jesus cooks a meal for him, but it doesn't just stop with the food. As we see in verse 15, he also then gently addresses what had caused the rupture. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. He asked it a second time. He asked it a third time. And the scriptures tell us that the third time, when he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Jesus asked, do you love me 3 times, mirroring Peter's denials. And this repetition grieved Peter because it forced him to confront, like, I did this 3 times, right? But it's this very process of naming it, not hiding it away, but gently confronting the rupture that helps to undo the shame and publicly reaffirm his commitment to Jesus. What are some other examples of rupture and repair in the Bible? I mean, there's so many. The story of Joseph in Genesis? I cry when I read this one because it's so poignant. Deep, deep rupture that gets repaired when Joseph chooses to confront, but also to forgive his brothers. We see examples of disagreements, Paul and Barnabas. Even in Philippians 2, we see Paul writing at the end of his letter, and he's pleading that Euodia and Syntyche, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her right, the women, he's pleading for them to get along, right? And he's asking someone to help them get along. How bad does it have to be when Paul's writing a letter and it's there's this 2 women who have this conflict in the church, right? So many more examples, but the reality that the Bible includes all of these shows us that to experience rupture is something inevitable. And our goal, while it might be to reduce the frequency of ruptures we experience, actually we will never get rid of them completely, just as Jessica said. And if anything, actually the existence of ruptures, perhaps it is a beautiful opportunity to experience growth in our spiritual formation as we work towards repair, and if we work towards repair. Engaging in repair creates tremendous opportunity for spiritual growth because it's a chance to obey God's commands to love, to practice humility, to practice forgiveness, engage in reconciliation. What psychology calls repair, Scripture often describes as reconciliation, which involves things like confession, repentance, forgiveness, restoration. And so then how is it that we can get better at this in the church? Because I think this applies to all churches, but if we consider some of the Asian kind of cultural variables and contextual variables, how can we get better at this in the church? I think first, we must grow in our ability to recognize the ruptures, both in ourselves and in other people. And because of social awareness, maybe we're better at it in recognizing other people than even ourselves. But I think we can improve also in recognizing other people. What are some signs of hidden rupture? It can look like very polite but thinner interactions, so your conversations stay sort of surface level or task focused. It can look like decreased emotional risks, so people stop sharing struggles or their honest opinions. There's a less willingness to disagree or offer ideas, so the vulnerability drops. It can look like subtle avoidance and disengagement. Have you ever been in a situation, it seems like they're taking way longer to respond to my text than they normally do. I'm going to make you all paranoid now. You'll be like, why aren't they responding to my text? Maybe person avoids one-to-one time with a person and just chooses group interactions instead. It can look like overcompensation with niceness, excessive politeness, affirmation, or formality, lingering tensions, assumptions that you don't ever check out and get clarity on, third-party process, talking to other people rather than talking directly to that person and seeking validation from somebody else. Once we've identified these ruptures, then what? Well, hopefully tomorrow the breakout sessions will give more practical examples, but I think starting that process of repair, it needs to start with a self-awareness and self-clarity. What's the reason I want to try and engage this person? And really have some clarity. And this is where I think therapy and just having good places to process can be helpful. Psalm 139, I think we can pray and ask for self-awareness and clarity. When David prays, he says, search me and know my heart, test me and see if there's something offensive in me, God. Right? So I think we can pray. I think Proverbs 15, it says, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer something. So it's taking some time to think. Philippians, counting others more significant than ourselves and considering that as we think about how to initiate gently. And I think once we've initiated a conversation, I think we do need to name the rupture. I was doing a parenting, marriage seminar thing last summer at a church in Atlanta. And after my talk, I remember a question that was asked from an audience member. It was a female audience. And she said, do we have to talk about it? Does it have to involve words? And I could feel her struggle. Because here's someone who, I'm making an assumption here, but based on what she was saying, maybe she realizes words are not her forte. Right? Maybe her love language is other ways to express. And if you think back to the Carby incident with my husband, there were no words exchanged there. There was meat exchanged, okay? Does it have to involve words? I do think that being able to name things is a skill that we should all strive to develop. While words may not always be sufficient, they do play an important part in addressing rupture and repair. And not all repair requires words, but without shared understanding that can only come through words, repair can sometimes be just partial. There is a lot of marital research and communication research that shows that while connection can be expressed non-verbally, consistently we find that verbal communication plays a critical role in relational health between spouses and between people. And research on Asian American families also suggests that while indirect communication in silence can be understood with both multiple parties, greater openness in verbal communication is associated with better psychological outcomes. This is especially the case in bicultural contexts. So they've done studies where they look at Asian American teenagers and their immigrant parents, and they find that with more verbal openness, it's actually a protective factor. It's linked to things like better adjustment and higher self-esteem. Right? And so if anything, even now, as we think towards future generation of our children who are being acculturated here and who are learning how to use words, we should strive to learn how to use words. Now, naming a rupture can also apply to our ruptures to God. We can name those. We see examples of this in the Bible all over the place, through the book of Job, through the Psalms of Lament, in Psalm 13. How long will you forget me, God? How long will you hide your face from me? And for those of us who may have grown up in contexts where it was not really deemed appropriate or respectful to express anger towards those in authority over you or towards your parents, this might feel like new territory to express anger at God over something. But the Bible tells us God can survive our anger. I love that he can do that. And so repair, and I think as we move towards repair, we see that this can actually be a deeply theological process. Moving towards people, confessing, repenting, forgiving. And so I think if we could strive to be churches that intentionally engage in discipleship and teaching that help us grow not only in God awareness, which is what the church should do, but also in our self-awareness, This would be a gift. And then if we could also be churches that intentionally engage in discipleship and teaching that help equip us to notice and respond to others well, this can also be a gift. I want to end with just 2 examples, because when I say equip us to respond to others well, I'm actually talking about something at a very practical level, okay? Let me give you an example, and this is kind of based, I'm sort of adapting it to protect anonymity, but one example, I'm going to give you 2 examples. One example I'm going to call an example of under-responding. So this is a true story. It happened with a men's group. And let's say Joe is in this men's group. They meet every other week. And he works up the courage to share with the men in his group, Asian American men, some really deep personal struggles he's having in his marriage and in other contexts, and some of the sins he's struggling with. What happened in this situation was Joe shared these things, and the men were silent. They were just quiet. Joe drove home that night berating himself. Why am I so stupid? Why did I even bring that up? I'm never going to share anything with it again. What was the unfulfilled need? It was a safety, I think, because he shared it and it just went out. It was like crickets. And I think these guys were just stunned. And I was thinking, what happened there? Like, did the guys not care? No, I know these guys. They all are loving guys. But I think what happened is they were so stunned with this vulnerability, and they had not experienced it before, and they were just at a loss of words. Like, they literally did not know what to say or how to respond. And it makes me wonder, I bet they've never actually been in contexts where people share vulnerable things and respond to each other. And so it didn't give them, they didn't have anything modeled to pull from. And so they just kind of sat there like deer in the headlights with this sharing. We can be churches that literally, it sounds elementary, but helping people know what you can say when someone shares, like, thank you for sharing, or that must be so painful, or even, I don't even know how to respond to you, but I love you, man, right? Okay, so just giving people tools can be really important. Let me give you one more example. This is an example I'm going to call over-responding, and this is also a true story. So consider a co-ed small group situation where members are somewhat new to one another, and because of this, they're sharing their testimonies of how they came to faith. And one member, he shares about his past life before he became a Christian, and actually it was very shocking, his past life. It involved some extreme violence, involved some graphic scenarios of things, and as he was sharing, he said, I'm kind of worried that you guys are going to judge me now because of what I'm sharing. So everyone's kind of listening, and a female member, I think she heard the, I worry that you're going to judge me. Okay, and so she doesn't want him to feel shame or feel judged, and so she kind of jumps in and she says, we're not going to judge you, we would never judge you. And then that's great, that would have been fine, like just there, but she kept going, and then she started to say things like, like, we know that you're a guy, you have such a good heart, and you didn't mean to do those things, and over time it becomes clear that actually her response is more out of her own discomfort with what had been shared, rather than responding to him. And in doing so, in overly sharing some of these optimistic comments and whatnot, it took away from the severity, actually, of the sinfulness and brokenness that he experienced, and it took away also from the awesomeness of God who had forgiven him and transformed his life. And had she been maybe more self-aware of the anxiety and discomfort she was feeling, maybe she would not have been so quick to fill it with the positive comments. In Ephesians 4, Paul exhorts us to be churches that are humble, gentle, bearing with one another. And in verse 15, we said, speaking the truth in love to each other, we will grow to become in every respect, the mature body of him. And I'll just end with this, because I know earlier I shared some of the challenges of Asian American kind of our context, but I don't want that to be something we only think of as things that limit us. Because in actuality, I feel like Asian American cultural values are so beautiful. I feel like God gives us these beautiful, beautiful values that we've inherited, honoring our elders, recognizing social awareness, recognizing our impact on others, identifying their needs, saving face, protecting people's dignity, interdependence, maintaining a harmony. These are all great things, and these are gifts that I've experienced in ways that I think are wonderful and I want to pass on to my children. I think, what would it be like to be a church where we actively embrace these values while not shying away from addressing these hidden ruptures and conflicts as we grow in our self-awareness to be able to discern what's really going on here, and then building up skills to actually love one another well. Thank you.